Hello, and welcome to the Seattle Atheist Church. Wow, there are so many of you here. Thanks so much for joining us today. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics.
Excuse me, sir. Who are you?
I'm Jack. I'm an officer with the Seattle Atheist Church. Thank you. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, freethinkers, questioning, and believers, whatever you like to call yourselves, you are welcome here. At the Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. The Seattle Atheist Church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics, which commits us, on the one hand, to reason and evidence-based thinking, and on the other, to compassion for our fellow humans. These commitments motivate us to oppose magical and wishful thinking and all forms of dogma, as well as to stand firmly against all forms of racism and racial superiority, against misogyny, against transphobia, against homophobia, and unequivocally against anti-Muslim bigotry. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all other conscious beings, and we believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds good to you, then you're in the right place. Before we get started with today's talk, we have a few announcements. Next Sunday, the 23rd, is our planning meeting, where we come together as a community to propose topics for talks that we'd like to hear, talks that we'd like to give, and then vote on those topics and get them on the calendar. The following Sunday, the 30th, Ruth is giving a talk on the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. Besides talks on Sundays, we have a number of other events throughout the month. Every second Sunday, we have a board game meetup after church at the Wayward Coffee House on 65th and Roosevelt. And every third Saturday of the month is our secular social at Brower's in Fremont at 3 p.m., which was yesterday this month. Thanks to everyone who came out. I had a great time chatting and getting to know you better. If you find these talks valuable and you enjoy the discussion afterwards, as I do, then please consider donating to support us. Your donations allow us to rent the room, provide refreshments, continue to foster the community that we've grown here, and put on larger events like this one. Today's suggested donation is $10 to help us defray some of the costs of today's event. If you'd like to make a donation in person here today, we accept cash back there in the jar on the table. And Troy has a PayPal card reader if you'd like to use credit. Troy, please stand and face the audience so we can see who you are. Okay. Thanks. We also have a donate button on our website at www.seattleatheist.church, where you can set up a monthly recurring donation if you prefer to set it and forget it. Another way you can contribute is to invite your friends and family. If you know someone who you think would enjoy what we do here, please invite them along. If there's someone from church whose company you enjoy, but you haven't seen for a while, reach out to them and catch up, perhaps over coffee or drinks. Our discussions get ever more valuable as we hear from more perspectives. Okay, so on with today's talk. As an atheist church whose mission is to build and facilitate community among the faithless, we want to show solidarity with fellow atheists of all races and from all places, especially those who are oppressed by conservative forms of coercive religions. One of the valuable lessons that has come out of the ongoing cultural conversation is that when a person from a minority background is speaking from the heart about their personal lived experience, it's important to simply listen, learn, and above all, take them seriously. Of course, no one individual can be expected to represent the totality of experience of all people who share their intersection of demographics. But each individual does speak to their unique perspective within the rich cultural tapestry of humanity. It is in this spirit that I am deeply honored to introduce as our guest Sarah Haider, who has come all the way from the other Washington, D.C., to speak with us today. After her talk, there will be some time for Q&A, so please have your questions ready, and please Make sure they end in a question mark. Pakistani by birth, American by choice, Sarah is an activist, speaker, and executive director of Ex-Muslims of North America. Raised in Texas, Sarah spent her early youth as a practicing Muslim, leaving religion in her late teens. Today, Sarah advocates for the acceptance of religious dissent and works to create local support communities for those who have left Islam. In addition to freethought, Sarah is particularly passionate about civil liberties and women's rights. Sarah has been profiled and featured in numerous magazines, news outlets, and shows, including The Economist, Slate, BBC, Global Journalist, Quillette, National Review, The Daily Beast, NPR, as well as The Stranger, right here in Seattle. You can reach Sarah on Twitter at the handle Sarah the Haider, spelled like her last name, and read more about XMNA at www.xmuslims.org. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sarah Haider.
Can everyone hear me okay? It's loud enough? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to the Seattle Atheist Church. I think it's the only atheist church I've ever been to, and I'm so excited to be here, for inviting me. And, I actually don't do this so often anymore. And by that I mean, can you all see me? I feel like I'm a little short. Maybe I need a booster. Is this okay? All right. Yeah, but I don't really do this as much anymore. So I try to make my talks count when I give them. And I want to try and talk about some of the deeper issues at hand and not just simply speak about, maybe my work and the very immediate issues that are at the forefront of my thoughts. I think it's very hard to avoid being swept up in current events and to stop and to really critically analyze the mistakes in thinking that we might be making. But I know that this audience is one that would appreciate going beyond day-to-day politics and current events, so I hope you'll find what I'm sharing with you here today to be challenging. I don't expect you to like it, necessarily, or to be very comfortable with it, but I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation, and that we can re-examine some of the ideas I think we've taken for granted too often. But I'll explain a little bit about myself and my work before I begin. I left Islam when I was 16 years old. I was raised Muslim. And when I left, I was absolutely alone. And this experience of isolation, I think, is one that many people who leave religion behind can share, especially people who came from fundamentalist backgrounds. I had never heard of anyone like myself, somebody who came from, especially from my background, who no longer believed. And then when I finally met an atheist for the first time, it was this incredible experience. And up until actually that point, I realized that I had taken for granted that I would never find anyone like myself. That's what I thought, that, as someone who can understand my context as an immigrant, as, a progressive, but a progressive who rejected kind of the complacent role that many confused compatriots play when speaking about this religion in particular. But I was lucky that I was relatively well-adjusted, and by that I mean I was largely raised in the United States, which meant that some of the struggles that other ex-Muslims go through, which is to say ex-Muslims who might be recent immigrants, were struggles that I didn't face as much specifically. But when I did meet another ex-Muslim for the first time, it was so exciting, and I didn't realize that it could change my life so much to know that I wasn't a crazy person, that it became clear to us that we needed to do something else. We needed to start making this a community. We needed to invite other ex-Muslims. We needed to make it a movement, if possible. So what started out first as just a community-building organization grew over time and expanded. Now we do videos, we do a lot of outreach work, and I found myself somehow in the role of an activist. By profession, I'm the executive director of Ex-Muslims of North America. But in essence, that's what I am. I'm an activist. And it's really something that I never thought I would be. And I don't shy away from that label, even though I think it can be off-putting to a lot of people. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this tendency, but I've noticed that activist is almost used as an insult when applied to other professions. Like, you're not a journalist, you're an activist, right? To imply that they have another motivation. Same with academics. You're not an academic, you're an activist, you have an agenda. So I see how people could think it could be off-putting, but I think also it's important to be upfront about who you are, what your central role is, and what you want. And what I want is to see a world without persecution by any religion, where we can all be free to actually follow our conscience. But to some degree, I won't deny that activism can feel as if it's at odds with unrestrained intellectual pursuit. And actually, I think this is one of the reasons that atheists in general have quite a bit of trouble organizing on a broader level. We're actually a larger percentage of the population than Jews and Muslims, I believe. But outside of local groups, we really have trouble organizing, or at least organizing with enough efficacy to really reflect our numbers in the population. And actually, if you don't include the word atheist, if you're just counting non-religious people, nuns, then that's a really broad, that's a large percentage of the population. But we don't really, isn't really reflected in our broader dialogue that we are a large cohort. So one of the explanations for this might just be that atheists and freethinkers have trouble with conformity, and I think this has a lot of truth to it. The other explanation might be that we don't really adhere to any ideology, at least in the sense that religious people adhere to ideologies. Even humanism, right? Many of us are humanists or freethinkers or call ourselves that. But even that, we don't believe with the kind of certainty that our religious counterparts can muster. And I can't, and maybe some of you will contradict this, but I actually haven't met an atheist who refuses religion because they love atheism, right? But people love their religions. People love Islam. People love Christianity. They love it. They love the tenets of it. Well, we love reason, right? We love truth, maybe, or what others can call basic common sense. But our goal isn't to pursue our truth, something that we know we have for sure, but to pursue the truth, whatever it might be. And the truth has almost an anti-political element to it, which is to say that the truth doesn't care about our politics. The truth is rigid. It's emotionally unsatisfying, and on occasion it's distressing. And it's complicated, and it's messy, and it doesn't care about political convenience. And I think that's at least part of why the question of Islam has been difficult to address for both sides of the political spectrum, fairly, but especially for the political left. That is to say, there's, when you really look at what the religion consists of, when you look at Muslim practices and when you look at Muslim beliefs, if it makes an obvious politically relevant point at all, it seems like maybe it makes a point for the other side, for the right. And I think a lot of you will be familiar with this kind of phenomena. But for example, I'll use immigration. If we were, as atheists or even progressives who value equality, to address head-on the startling levels of sexism within the Muslim community and implicit within the Quran, we fear, rightly, I think we have a reason to fear this, that our criticisms will be used for an anti-immigration agenda or some other agenda we don't really want to pursue. So is anyone really surprised in such a circumstance that there is a tendency to refuse to look in the direction of Islam at all? Let's just pretend like this is not happening and it doesn't exist and there's nothing to cover here, given all the unsavory political conclusions that it might aim. So I think atheists in particular are left in a really tough position in a true bind that is far worse than that of even the average progressive, which is to say that it's impossible for us, people who care so much about intellectual consistency, to be intellectually consistent without fearing like we're going to add into an agenda that we don't want. raging against Christianity for misogyny, but then not really doing the same or to the same degree with regards to the horrors in Islam, well, that's a recipe for some painful cognitive dissonance. And I think that's what's going on in the free thought, humanist, atheist community. But despite all of that, I'm actually not here to talk about politics today. If you want to know the many gripes that myself and other ex-Muslims have against the left, you can go online and check out the countless, truly countless and growing ex-Muslim voices on YouTube, on blogs, who are sharing their feelings of abandonment. Or you can even just read the news, right? You can just pay attention to what media outlets who have a progressive lean have to say about the Quran, the hijab, Muslim practice as a whole. And you'll find there that there is kind of an absurd level of whitewashing, almost as if we know that there's something that we're not saying here, and we all have an implicit agreement to just not talk about it. And yes, this is in response to the demonization of Muslims that happens on the other side of the political spectrum, but still, we're not telling the truth about something. And if you want to hear more about me speaking about this issue, I spoke about this many years ago for the first time when I was just getting started in activism at the American Humanist Association's conference, and my talk was called "The Necessity of Liberal Critique," and I go on about this for almost an hour. So if you're interested, that's where to go. But like I said, the specific detailed political struggles that are implicit within the conversation of Islam are not really what I'm here to talk about. A large part of my work is to think about the ways in which our desires, our emotional needs, and our popular discourse gets in the way of embracing free thought, of accepting uncomfortable truths about the world, right? Like the truth about Islam. So what's getting in our way? Well, political considerations are one, and I just mentioned that a little bit. But I want to talk about some of the other ways in which I think our desire for universalism is disappearing, and that there's a weakening of the foundations of our liberal society, of this idea that we can all work together, we can all persuade each other, we can all gradually move towards this better world with greater freedom and prosperity and happiness. I think we are losing sight of our common humanity to some degree. And we're retreating to what can only be called tribes that pretend to care about ideological consistency and principles. We envelope ourselves around others who think just like us, who have the right ideas, and we draw lines of difference. And it should be concerning to all of us that identity-based tribes have reemerged in our political discourse on the entire spectrum. These are not identity politics tribes that are from the tradition of the civil rights era, for example, but these are something altogether different. Most grotesque are the white identity groups that have been given just a new life, that are experiencing a kind of revival that I think really only a few of us could have ever predicted would be even possible just a few years ago. They're not the only identity-based group. It seems our entire political discourse is dependent on some level on who you are as a speaker. What practices you can adapt, what cuisines you can take up, what aspects of the political dialogue you can participate in. It seems to matter more and more who you are. So it should come to no surprise that people are beginning again to look inward. And that sounds like maybe it's not a terrible thing, but I'll tell you what part of it is a little disconcerting to me. So I remember a time, for me, when identity, this fuzzy concept of who I really am and who I thought I was allowed to be, was a lot less clear than it is now. I was born in Karachi, Pakistan. It's the capital of Pakistan, which means that I'm an immigrant. English isn't my native language. I hope you guys can't tell, but some people can tell, and it's so embarrassing. But I was raised Muslim, and largely I'm familiar with the Western Muslim community, and I was raised in rather conservative part of the U.S. in Texas, and there were, I remember, churches and even temples just around every corner. I grew up across church bells, literally. Religion was just everywhere, and it was especially present in my own home. It was a deeply important part of me. And I remember the process of learning English as a young immigrant to the States. My parents were teaching me phrases in English before I came, just to prepare me. And I remember the first one was, "My name is Sarah, I am 7 years old, and my religion is Islam." It was thought by the adults around me that my religion was such an important part of who I was that it was worth including even in this initial introduction. Just, "Hi, my name is Sarah, and by the way." And in Pakistan, it's the fact that you are religious, that you have to be a believer, that's kind of taken for granted. Religion is on your birth certificate. Religion is on your ID, your passport. It's a permanent part of you, or seen to be a permanent part of you. And it was a big part of what I thought made me me. So what I'd like to discuss here today is a more general concept relating to identity and what we find to be a real or true sense of who we are, what we find to be authentic. Specifically, that term, authentic, is one that I want to discuss. This is especially the relationship that I think we have with this concept that most people really think is quite innocuous, right? This idea of authenticity, particularly in the sense of identity and cultural authenticity. This seems like a concept no one can have a problem with, right? Popular culture, especially Western popular culture, is full of these feel-good, Oprah Winfrey certified truisms relating to authenticity. Be true to you, be the real you were always meant to be, right? I mean, you recognize this language, right? Authenticity is one of those concepts that we have almost nothing but positive associations with. It's like this warm, like fuzzy sweater of a concept. But despite all these positive associations, it's also something that most people can't define very easily. So I'd like you to think about that right now. Define authenticity. How would you define it in your head? What makes something authentic? Well, maybe it's when something is true, right? But not the truth. True to something. True to what, right? It's related to clearer concepts like sincerity and truth. But with authenticity, it's something we know it when we see it, or rather when we feel it. And although we can't really clearly distinguish usually what authenticity looks like, we seek it within ourselves and we seek it in others. And often it's provoked in this personal sense. Finding authenticity is discovering who we really are, who we were meant to be. But sometimes it's evoked in this broader sense, I think in a more insidious sense, of belonging to a community or a group which is authentic. So after searching for some time, I found a definition that I think makes some sense from anthropologist Charles Lindholm, who defined authenticity like this. He said, "Persons are authentic if they are true to their roots or if their lives are a direct and immediate expression of their essence," right? If they're true to their roots, they're authentic. Similarly, collectives are authentic if their biological heritage can be traced and if the members act in the proper, culturally valued manner. So for me, having been raised Muslim in a Pakistani community, acting in a culturally valued manner meant adopting modesty-oriented dress codes. It meant staying away from certain kinds of food and not having sexual relations with the opposite sex, or really any kind of sexual relations until marriage. But I abided by all those things, but not only because that's what was expected of me, but because at that time I believed it was the right thing to do. That was how God had told me to live in this world. But eventually I left the faith, and this change of belief had a monumental impact on me. But for some people, I know that religion is kind of this side endeavor. This is just something you go to church on Sunday and that's about it. But like most Muslims, I took my religion very seriously, and it underpinned much of what I thought about the world, about how it functions now, the reality, what it is, and how it should function, what we should be aiming for. And it affected the way I felt about policy, especially on social questions like who we should marry, what sort of speech should be allowed, and most importantly, my faith gave me a sense of knowing my place in the world. When I left, I found that I had to rebuild up this purpose for myself. And for the most part, this was a really, truly thrilling experience. It was like the world had just opened up and I had every option available. But with this choice also came a sense of rootlessness. I no longer had an identity card for me, so that's freedom, right? But also, it could be a little scary. A place in the world that was my own, that doesn't exist anymore. A role with expectations and duties already assigned, those things can be comforting. I think we don't like to admit the extent to which we're comforted by them, even while we're talking about how constraining they are. I don't think we pay enough attention to the negative feelings that may arise with astounding levels of choice and freedom that we have in the modern world. Think about the lives your grandparents led, right? They had far fewer options in every single sense of the word. Options for who they could marry. Maybe they lived in a little village and they had 10 possible candidates, maybe less. Where to get their news. They might not have had a place to get news. Maybe they just heard things from your neighbor. Their values, their opinions, all of these things. They just had fewer options to choose from, sometimes no options at all. And in our freer world, thankfully, we have a lot more options. But I think those options come with a cost. And some philosophers have suggested that the appeal of the idea of authenticity, of the desire to be authentic, particularly in that romantic sense of like a more wholesome, rooted, pure life, is driven partially because we might feel burdened with the pressures of this freer world, that we might in some way be lost among all these choices. But just because of the desire for a more pure way of being is understandable, that does not mean it necessarily plays a positive role in our lives. It can, of course, but I think we should be careful. In fact, in many ways, I think we're chasing a fantasy. Sometimes the drive to go back to our roots means moving to the country, getting a chicken coop, right? But history shows us that this romanticism of a more authentic life can and has been exploited for darker ends. Remember the definition I shared earlier? You probably don't, I'll repeat it. About authentic collectives. So Charles Lindholm said that collectives are authentic if their biological heritage can be traced and if the members act in a proper, culturally valued manner. The phrase, especially biological heritage, that should give us pause. The idea that we must have a certain genealogical background, that we have to behave a certain way, that's a little scary, right? For minorities or other smaller communities who are distinct from mainstream culture, this lure of authenticity can turn into a kind of stagnation of progress and change within the community itself. And for its members, it can become a constraint on who they are free to be. As an ex-Muslim, I am frequently accused of being kind of a traitor to my people. And I've been thinking about why that is. And I think it harkens to this idea that I have left behind this ideological tradition that my great-great-grandparents followed and cherished, and I no longer follow and cherish it, and I abandon it. And because I abandoned it, I have abandoned them, and I have abandoned my people, and I've abandoned who I am in some sort of essential sense. It is believed by some that atheism, secularism, even, if you could believe it, the values of the Enlightenment and even scientific tradition as a whole are all owned in some sense by Western cultures. That they are part of the Western tradition, so they belong to the West. And that means that if you are an outsider and you adopt these values or practices, you are in some way betraying your tribe for another. And it's clear, I hope by now, how this is a really cancerous idea. Often I get this smear of being called a native informant because I am an ex-Muslim and because I talk about the problems of Islam. If those of you who haven't heard the term native informant, the people who apply it to us don't think it's a smear, but I certainly consider it one. And it's applied to us even by academics, and they're referring exactly to this idea, that by leaving Islam, by adopting secular principles, by loudly combating the problematic aspects of our former faith communities, we are traitors. Most sinister is the idea, I think, that if a practice or trait has been valued historically by a culture, that it cannot be considered as harmful as we might consider it in our own context. That it matters that it was valued before, and we should take that into consideration when we're judging it today. The most prominent example of this tendency, and I'm sure you guys already have heard of this, but that is of the hijab. There are many who are reluctant to address this sexist, truly sexist symbolism behind this modesty garment, because they think that on some level, the fact that the hijab is this very traditional practice means that it is in some sense valuable, has a value as a cultural practice. It should come to no surprise that whenever there is an authentic culture we can harken back to, one inevitably finds that religious conservatives and even fundamentalists are leading the way to this more pure society, to this more authentic community. Think about why and when you hear the phrase, America is a Christian nation, or America was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. What's the purpose of such a statement? Right? Forget for a second whether or not it's true. Like, let's assume that it is. Why would this even be a useful rhetorical device? I think it's because they're referencing a tradition, and they know that that reference is valuable. This founding root, this appeal to our desire to stay true to our roots. They're saying that if America becomes less Judeo-Christian, it will become less like its truest, purest, best self. Nationalist, far-right, ethnocentric groups all across time have frequently centered authenticity, the idea of authenticity, in their picture of an ideal, purified society. And they always have this wonderful, idyllic landscape that they paint about such a society. In the United States, many of the supporters of President Donald Trump specifically cite his seemingly authentic persona. They do. In my work, I've seen people fall into truly deep religious traditionalism, even fanaticism, in search of this simpler, pure, less corrupt way of life, free from this taint of the secular world and the modern pressures and consumerism. It's the same impulse, actually, that motivates groups like the extreme far-right group today and ISIS. All you have to do is read their literature, and that's the society that they will paint. They will promise you a pure, authentic, simple society. But in all likelihood, the search for an authentic utopia is one for something that never was. And in seeking this dream, I'm worried that we may be led to something of a nightmare. The search for an authentic self might be even more harmful. Instead of accepting and even welcoming our identities, truly creating ourselves, forming ourselves, we seek the certainty of an inner essence that we just have to find. You know, we often talk about nuance, about complexity, but in practice, we tend to adopt a variety of shortcuts in our thinking, carelessly, without examining the harms of such ideas. Ideas that sound so wonderful when you just mention them, like authenticity. But as rationalists and freethinkers, I think we are particularly suited for the task of examining critically these sacred cows, these comforting ideas. But we are not immune, even us, from the lure of such emotionally satisfying notes. And that's actually the end of what I have prepared for you today. If you enjoyed this and want to know more about ex-Muslims of North America, please go to our website. That's exmuslims.org. Our pamphlets are here somewhere. And you can go to they're over there. Yeah, they're over there, and you can pick them up. I would appreciate that. And I think we have time for questions. Yeah, something like that if you have them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To line up and stand in line, so we'll just have to take questions.
I'll repeat the question.
And, yeah, if you could repeat the question. I guess I'll be the moderator, and if you don't mind, I'd like to abuse my power just once. Ask you a question real quick. So, in the age of Trump, what can we do to oppose anti-Muslim bigotry effectively while remaining firm to our commitment to evidence-based, non-magical thinking, as well as to our commitment to support ex-Muslims and other atheists? How can we be good allies to both Muslims and ex-Muslims?
Well, I think there are many answers to this, but the simplest one is to remember the value of civil liberties, which is to say we don't have to agree with Muslims. We don't have to say that their practices are better than they are or more desirable, maybe not as harmful. We don't have to say any of this to stand with them when their civil liberties are under threat or when they are facing bigotry. And in fact, it is a stronger stance to take. We have a more powerful voice. If we can say two things at the same time, we can say, even we don't agree with anything that you're doing, we don't believe that your God is a real one, we don't find your practices to be anything but harmful. Yet, we know that in America, we all have rights as citizens, and you deserve protection from bigotry, etc. I think just that simple sentiment is extremely important. And, I know it can be confusing, and I know it can be really difficult, especially because there are a lot of people who are too ready to call anyone who criticizes Islam a bigot, especially if they come from a non-ex-Muslim or non-Muslim background in general. So I know that it can be hard. But principles are principles for a reason. They help guide us for a reason. We need them for a reason because when we're actually moving forward in our day-to-day lives, it's too easy to get swept up in one emotionally satisfying narrative or another.
Emma, sure.
Hi. You said that you were alone when you left, when you became an ex-Muslim, and I was wondering how you have compensated and found community. Do you go to a secular church, or how have you filled that void?
So part of it has been, and I glossed over this a little bit, I think, in my talk, but this is partially why ex-Muslims in North America exists. It's to give people this sense of community. We build communities all across the United States and Canada, which is to say we foster them the best we can. We have security processes, and the idea is just to give people an alternative to losing or potentially losing their families and all their former faith communities, which can be so devastating to people, and specifically, I think, more devastating to people who don't fit in a lot of other ways as well. For me, I know people who were very, very recent immigrants and came to the United States, and they want somebody where they can speak their language. They want somebody where they can talk about, what it's like back home and share those experiences. But to do that and to be, let's say, Pakistani and be an atheist, well, where are you going to find people like yourselves? Many of us are in the closet. I borrow the language of the gay rights movement quite a bit, actually, and we use a lot of their tactics too to try and change things. But many of us are in the closet because we're so afraid of being abandoned by our communities. So yeah, if there are ex-Muslims who are listening to this or here, ex-Muslim North America build some communities. Otherwise, local atheist groups they're there in most major cities. They're there and they're very welcoming to ex-Muslims, and that's an option out there.
Well, this is a kind of an uncomfortable question for me, but I'd like you to address the idea of female genital mutilation, which is, of course, I think a horror, but I've been told from different sources that it's endemic to Islam, and others have told me that it is endemic to cultures. It's a cultural thing more than a religious thing. Could you educate me on this regard?
Yeah, just briefly. So, do I need to repeat, actually? Can everybody hear? Is that okay for the recording, you think?
I think it's okay.
Okay. Well, there's no reason it can't be both. That's the first answer. And in fact, it is a little bit of both. And there are so many cultural practices that used to be cultural only, that then got codified within a faith, or within certain sects of the faith or certain interpretations of the faith. And that's kind of what we found with female genital mutilation. I know that it's a common tactic to say that it's the culture and not the religion. I don't understand why that would make things so much better. But in reality, religion does matter. And many people who actually say that they'll say it's an African thing purely. That's the common retort against the religious influence of FGM. But in reality, we'll actually find it outside of Africa in specific religious communities, specific branches of Islam, schools of thought that are more serious about female genital mutilation than others. We see it in India, I think in Indonesia. So it's actually spread out, and I don't think there's enough knowledge about where it happens and when it happens to I think for anyone to fairly say that it's only an African thing, and in fact we know that that's not true. Yeah.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah. My name is Alex Zimmerman, and I am a Jew, and I am in church, synagogue, in mosque, probably 30 plus years. I understand that.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you speak up?
Okay. My name is Alex Zimmerman. I'm a Jew. For the last 30 plus years, but as I live in Seattle, I'm in probably 30 plus.
Hold on.
I'm in church, synagogue, in mosque. I try to understand if Buddhist, atheist. Yeah. For the last 20 years, Seattle have a new religion. This is very important. I call this a common Nazi fascism. So my question very simple. Why? In every people who represent God from different sides, I never see one talk about fascism, what is Seattle have right now. It's a real problem what is we have right now. This what is we need to concentrate, because it's key what is change us life. You understand about talking in fascism is against all religion.
So what's the question? I didn't quite understand the question.
Okay,
What was just the question?
Seattle have a new religion right now. I call this common Nazi fascism. So wherever I go, like this guy, he's from church, yeah, from another church, from synagogue, or from mosque. You know what it means? Nobody mentioned word fascism. Why?
Nobody. I don't know if I can answer that question.
I can answer that. Okay, so we finally got a question with a question mark on the end. So make sure your questions have a question mark on the end. The question was, why is no one talking about fascism? We do talk about fascism at Seattle Atheist Church. I don't know if you want to make any comment on fascism.
Fascism is bad.
Take another.
One quick point. If anyone would like to see or the talk we had about anti-fascism, that is up on YouTube. So you can peruse that at your leisure. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Adil. I'm a member of XMNA, so thank you for spearheading that movement. I think I related a lot to your talks about how when you're religious, it's almost like you have a paved road in front of you and you're guided along that path. And when you finally leave religion, it's like you have this big open field, and that's exciting in and of itself, but it has, sort of connotations of anxieties, because where do you go from here? As someone who's still working myself through these questions of, like my identity, my purpose, what sort of influence I want to have on the world, what sort of advice would you have?
Advice would I have for you trying to find your way in the world?
Yeah, like I'm guessing you've been in this field for
for a very long time.
So.
Yeah, so it's been a while since I left Islam, and when I had that struggle right in the beginning, and one of the things that I have learned at this point is that I no longer expect a sense of total completeness. You see what I mean? It's never going to feel completely right. And in fact, anything that promises you unity is probably a cult. It's like there's some we should be doubting people who can and movements and groups who can promise us that we will fit in perfectly like puzzle pieces, and we will have no wars that are being raged in our own heads, and we won't feel sometimes that we're imposters or we don't belong here, or we need to find a place where we belong a little bit more. We'll always, that this is a journey, and there isn't necessarily even an end goal to get to. You just find peace with where you are, and you learn to enjoy that process.
My question is about the conflict that seems to appear on the progressive side between those who espouse so-called classical liberalism and those who espouse so-called postmodernism. That is essentially the classical liberals accuse part of the activism, basically the extreme left activism is based on postmodernism. And my question to you is, have you considered actually the results of postmodern thought, 20th century philosophy, as a sort of addition to whatever has come out of the reason-based, evidence-based reasoning that came from the Enlightenment, as something that could inform your thinking and inform your activism, especially relating to the idea of authenticity, because I think it is really
Right. So yeah, I think even there's a strain of thinking, especially in the circles that I run in, which is people who are willing to be more upfront about Islam and say, well, this is maybe something not we want to go towards. That there is a reactionary rejection towards everything that postmodernism has to offer. And that is even the case with any far left ideology. I think that there's just a rejection of it. I went on for a bit. I don't agree with that, and I think that there are insights to be found there. I haven't particularly looked back into postmodernism precisely because I find the extreme relativism to be off-putting, and in fact insulting when applied to things like the hijab and to something like female genital mutilation, to go on a very extreme end. And I've heard, unfortunately, maybe more of the extreme voices that come from the postmodernist philosophy that seem to think that, well, this can just be understood in that context, and therefore we have no right legitimately to do anything about it. And so I found that disturbing in the past, which is why I haven't poured into it too much. But yeah, I'll consider that, and that's something I will look into. I'm open to. Can I also have a fan?
Oh, yes.
I've got a lot of fans out here.
Kathleen, sorry.
From a small population of Muslim women's writings that I've read, I have the impression that at least some Muslim women consider themselves feminists, and also Muslim. How do you explain that? I mean, is it possible to be feminist and Muslim?
It depends on how much you as an individual care about consistency. For me, to me it matters that something makes sense and is internally coherent. So for me, I would say that no, it is not possible to be a feminist, or at least in the feminist, the classical sense of the term, at least up until second wave feminism, and large parts of third wave feminism as well, that there's no way to really have that make sense along with Islamic theology. But there is no end to the imaginations of people when they really want to believe something. And I think Islamic feminism, not to be too dismissive of it, because there are many incredible, amazing women, intelligent women who are involved in this endeavor to make the religion in line, or to interpret the religion in line with feminist principles. Still, I think that we have to acknowledge that Islam is a deeply gendered religion, from its very foundations up until the very specific aspects of how to believe and why to believe. What heaven even consists of is different for men and women, which is absurd. We should look into it at some point if you want to be upset. So there's that gendered element of it that cannot be taken away, and I think that there's, especially classical feminist thought, cannot make sense of that or align with that.
Sir, from the side here.
Yeah, what can us never Muslim sympathizers do to help
there's a lot you can do, actually. I think what I have to say, and I want to say, is that if you have money, you should donate to my nonprofit, Ex-Muslims in North America. And John has generously given before, so it's really lovely to have him here. And he actually invited me here, brought me here, so that's nice. So you can give to my organization. You can volunteer for us if you have time and not money. You can also just participate in the dialogue, right? Amplify the voices of ex-Muslims when you hear one. If you see a good article, just share it along and pass that information to people you know. And that's just a simple and easy way to do it. And I know that even that can feel intimidating at times, because sometimes you can get a real serious pushback, and especially in these days when social media is kind of a dangerous thing to do, or it feels like one at times, right? But certainly that's an easy way to do it. That's an easy way to help, and it's appreciated, absolutely, by us. Thank you.
Yeah, you back.
Thank you for coming. Thanks for the work that you do. I think it's pretty great.
Thank you.
My question is, I am curious, how deep was your engagement with theology before you left? Like, did you read the Quran? Did you read the tafsir? Did you really try to get an understanding? Because, like, some of the, and I'm not familiar with your work, and I'm sure you've engaged with your critiques in a more thorough way in other venues, but when people say things like, you know, hijab is frivolous, and, you know, they only speak about it as a signifier of modesty, that's like a very, that's almost pejorative. It's so simplistic in articulation of the theory of hijab. That's it, right? So my question is, like, how deeply did you engage with the different explanations, or the different traditions, or the different interpretations, just in the same sense as which, you know, I could say that rationality and free thinking are utopic. They strike me as utopic. I don't know if all human cognition is ever going to be endowed with the capacity to be fully free. I think human fallibility is really deep. And that's one thing that, I mean, I'm on the spectrum of somewhere between being Muslim and not. But one of the wonderful things that I think Islam really endears me to, and I don't know if I would have gotten it from an atheist tradition, is the notion of human fallibility, and seeing it in so many different traditions, from Western Enlightenment to you know, certain practices endemic to South Asian Islam, let's say. My question is, how deeply did you engage? At what point did you feel confident enough? Like, okay, now I get it. Now I know what Islam is. Now I know what the hijab means, and now I can, you know, does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So even all the things you brought up, I think I could go on about for quite a long period of time. So this is not going to be sufficient of an answer. But I do have kind of a simple explanation for how deeply I engaged with it. I was a practicing Muslim, and I was serious about my belief. In fact, I was a kind of an evangelist. Evangelist? Is that what I would say? Yeah. I evangelized for my faith from the time that I came to America and I realized not everybody was a Muslim. I just had to save them. And I remember from a young age being devastated by the idea that, my best friend might go to hell because she doesn't believe in all these things. So I made sure that I knew as much as I could, and I was almost preparing myself for apologetics, religious apologetics, and that I would try and take down Christianity and Christian belief systems and try and show why Islam was superior. And I did that from as early as I can remember discussing religion at all. So the interest, I always had a very, very strong interest in religion itself and what it meant. But my process of leaving was a little bit different in that some people look into the Quran and find internal inconsistencies, lots of people, or hypocrisies or what have you. And some of these things I found after leaving. But it just so happened that my journey was that I became an atheist before I became an ex-Muslim. I don't know if that's something that makes sense, but I stopped believing in the idea of the kind of God described both in Islam and in Christianity and in Judaism, right? I stopped believing in that particular God or any kind of higher deity. I reference a lot of philosophical traditions and those sorts of things were what led me out of the faith. And I remember recognizing, so I don't believe in God at all, and the idea of a God sounds silly, so I guess that means I'm not Muslim. I remember thinking that, and that's when I also went into it and thought about how, well, now that I'm approaching things with a secular morality, and now that I have to look into different kinds of ethics, how does Islam pair up? And in many ways I found that it doesn't pair up well at all, especially if we're looking into the very, very useful intellectual traditions of modern liberal thought. And I think Islam in many ways just doesn't align with them very well at all. And I think it's part of the reason that the Muslim world is where it is. You mentioned something about the idea of infallibility in religion and why that you found it to be this wonderful thing. And I see where you're coming from. I understand why that can be a positive thing, to remember the infallibility of man, right? That's what you said? That's what... infallibility of reason, sure. And I think that's a good lesson. But that's not just a lesson that it teaches you, right? It teaches you that there's an that man is not fallible. But here's this perfect book, and it tells you everything that you need to know. And all you have to do is adhere as closely and as faithfully to what is being written here, and you will have a good life and you will be a good person. It's an invitation not just to say that my reasoning is not infallible, but it's an invitation to turn off your brain entirely and to not look at the horrors that you might be seeing taking place in the name of religion. So that's somewhat of some short answer, but that was an interesting question. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
How hopeful are you for secularism spreading in these more traditionally religious countries like Saudi Arabia as well? Like, do you see in 50 years race rights being changed there, or do you think it's going to take an even longer time frame?
You know, it's a strange thing to try and hypothesize about the future, because there's so many things that we don't know how they're going to play out. But I'm sometimes frustrated with the extent to which people just think that the Muslim world is doomed. You know, that it's doomed to this backward way of thinking, and they're never going to improve, and that's just the way it is. And I get frustrated with that, because I know that that's not true, and that there's a capacity there for achievement and prosperity that just just needs a few conditions to make it possible. There have always been free thinkers from the Muslim community, always. Since the advent of Islam, there have been people who have said, wait a minute, I don't know. And they have been persecuted, right? They've been murdered. They've been forced to go into exile, and we don't hear from those voices. They crop up all the time, even in that environment, but they're quickly quenched. But something is changing, I think, and that has a lot to do with the internet. That has a lot to do with the fact that for the first time, we are able to have conversations without fear of personal consequences. And people, especially in the Muslim world and the Arab world, where it's just not that free. You can't just go and buy an atheist book off a bookshelf. You can't discuss these things out loud. You might not even want to talk about them with your family. Well, now there is a space you can go, and you can be exposed to these ideas, and you can share these ideas with others without as much fear. Of course, people still get hunted, and governments are trying to find atheists, anonymous accounts that are operating and talking about criticizing religion and what have you. But still, this is a window that has opened up that I think a lot of people couldn't have imagined possible, and we are seeing a growth of people who are just abandoning religion altogether from Muslim communities, and we're seeing that on a level that I couldn't have imagined, that I wouldn't have thought possible. And it might just be because the faults of religion are very clear to some of these people, right? You're living in this kind of society where religion is all around you, and all the ways that it fails are clear and in your face all the time.
So you said in the past that you would oppose certain government-mandated secularism, like for instance, banning a Muslim parent's right to make their daughters wear a hijab, for instance. You said it could be counterproductive.
Yeah.
I'd like your reaction to maybe just a quick steel manning of the opposite side of that, or the supporting the right for the government to restrict.
You would like me to support the right of the government?
I know. If I could just give you the
if you could give me
quick
the
case and
sure.
then you just react to it. So like something like FGM, for instance, we could regard it as so obviously unethical and wrong that we wouldn't want to give us any kind of leeway to, just because it's a cultural religious practice, we'd want to restrict the rights of people to do that. And as for lesser harm, such as mandating that your children wear a certain religious garb, would you maybe agree that to support the right of someone to do that, to mandate that their children wear this garb that is rooted in something like misogyny, it is in a sense to grant a kind of that kind of leeway, a kind of double standard to a religious practice where under secular auspices it wouldn't fly. And if we regard our activism as secularists and atheists as not just a kind of intellectual progress, but also moral progress, something analogous to like we mentioned earlier, the gay rights, how our progress along gay rights, it was social activism, but eventually there was a role for government to play to say that there are limits to what religious conservatives can do. So do you think there's a case to be made there for, in the future maybe, for the government to have a place to stand and say it is wrong to force your daughter to wear a hijab?
This is a pretty big topic of debate and something that is quite contentious among ex-Muslims and even people who are secularists who are talking and thinking about these issues. And I land on a side that even I think many ex-Muslims don't love, which is to say that I think freedom of expression is paramount. I think that it is the foundational, it is the foundation of our liberal society, and that means tolerating things that are otherwise that we might know, or we might very strongly feel are harmful. There are limits, right? And FGM actually is a limit of that because there's a bodily harm that's happening, and there are conversations about religious people and not going to the doctor because they don't believe in a certain kind of practices and that kind of thing. So this debate can get very, if you look at the fine tunes of it, it can get really intense. But I think on a general level, to the extent that the hijab is expression, I think it's important that we uphold their right to express things, even if we don't like what it's expressing. And the other reason for that is that we do have to acknowledge, and I think this, I'm not sure what your name is, I'm sorry, but the other questioner that she brought up, that the hijab means different things for different people. Now, I think as a whole, it is outrageous to not think about the ways in which it has been used for millennia, and is being used for, to oppress millions of women around the world, right? And it's outrageous to think about it outside of that context. We have to think about it within that context. But when you are in the West and you are a young woman, you grow up within this faith tradition, you believe in its tenets, and you choose to put it on, right? And choice is a bizarre word to use in this discussion, because what is a choice, right? And if you've been only told this one sort of thing your whole life, to what extent is it a choice? So even that's its own discussion. But I think that the idea that it can be counterproductive to have these bans is a really important case to make. I think it is important that if we can convince Muslims to abandon aspects of their religion, that they are along for the ride, that they agree with us that it is harmful, they agree with us that it can hurt people. And the counterproductive aspect of it, it's very real. And if you look at some of the activists for the burqa, and the niqab, the face veil, in the UK, in all parts of Europe, if you look at these women who are advocating for how great of a practice this facial covering is, many of them They will say that I didn't like that the government said I couldn't do it, or that it was implied that the government could force me to take it off. Who are you to tell me what to do? I'm going to put it on. I mean, that element of, we don't like it when the government forces us to do certain things, and it does. There are many, many people for whom the opposite effect is almost an inevitability. Part of the reason I'm also sympathetic to this is because I know I would have been one of those women. I know I would have been one of those women. And I did put on the hijab, actually, when I was young. Nobody made me. My family is conservative from an American Western standard, in that I couldn't dress like this, for example, and I couldn't date, and I was expected to be arranged marriage and all that. But other than that, from a general Muslim perspective, my parents allowed me to read other books and to explore ideas outside of faith. And I chose to put it on because I believed in it. And I think if we want lasting change, what we have to convince people is like, hey, does this really make sense? I mean, you're making a huge lifestyle choice, and you're forcing this thing upon your daughters and your female family members. So you really need to believe in this and believe in it 100%. So I think that counterproductive element of it, the idea that banning something really has counterproductive elements, I think that can't be ignored. And it does make it harder for us to say what is true right now, which is that in the Western world, women can make choices. Women can choose to be wrong in the West, right? Women are human and sometimes they're wrong, and they can choose to be that way, and we will have a civil conversation about it, and hopefully they'll change their minds, right? That's what we have going for us, this freedom to really live your life according to your conscience. And I think that if we change our stance on that we're going to expose hypocrisy there. That'll make it even harder for us to reach Muslim communities.
First of all, I just wanted to thank you for the video and continuing to be a voice of reason for a very important conversation.
Thank you.
I wrote my question down so we can quick.
Okay.
I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, because I've actually heard you get asked it, respond, and podcasts and other things. But I wanted to get an idea of how you approach coming to a stance on this issue. So some reasonable and respected people think that religion is not necessarily the problem, but extremism is. And we should put our efforts into promoting moderation and liberalism within religion, and that trying to convince people to drop their religion and become atheists is just not going to happen with billions of people. What's your response to that? How do you suggest the path forward?
Yeah. I mean, and this is usually in the context, that question is asked usually in the context of, should we try to go for Islamic reform, or should we try and just convince Muslims that this is bunk altogether and hope we can encourage apostasy? It's usually asked in that context. And for many people, the instinct is to say the easier path forward is just to ask them to just cool it a little bit. And things are different in the West, and hopefully this will move things forward. That's, I think, what everybody assumes will be the easier path and the more sustainable path. I disagree. In that, of course, we can do this. We can continue to do this. We can ask this of them, and people do. And I'm not opposed to that idea at all. But I am doubtful that it can work on a large level, and it can work to the degree and have the kind of permanence that we really want. Especially when we're discussing religious belief, and we're discussing Islam in particular, which has this idea of perfection, that this is the perfect final word. Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, and there will never be anything coming after this that is more perfect. So it matters in that context that we also give people a little bit of doubt to the truth of their faith. And what I'm not saying, and what I don't think, is we're going to convert all the Muslims out and they're all going to be apostates. I don't think that. Of course, that's a little bit ridiculous. But what I do think can happen, without a lot of work, is just a little bit of doubt that they each carry within the truth of their faith. And to some degree, I think to a large degree, this is true of religious people in the Western world, in that they're very sure that that this is probably right, but they will acknowledge that there are other ways of getting to the truth, they'll say, that there are many ways to reach heaven. Even very religious people sometimes pay homage to this kind of thinking. And what it reveals is that, well, I'm pretty sure that this is the right way, but I'm not 100% sure enough that I can tolerate other people of different beliefs. Because, and again, this goes back to the point of acknowledging that you're a little bit fallible in the ideologies we adopt right now. And I think this doubt, this teeny bit of doubt, is central to the ability of pluralism as a doctrine, pluralism as a national ethos, to be something that can really prosper in the Muslim community. Because why would I tolerate your belief if I'm 100% sure you are wrong and you are the devil? Right? You're coming and you're spreading all these ideas, and maybe my child will believe you, and then he'll go off and then he'll be doomed to hell. Why would I tolerate this? I would never tolerate it. I mean, it's logical that you wouldn't, right? If you love your children, if you love, your community, if you really believe in this, why would you? Why would you tolerate? But if there's a little bit of doubt, just a little bit, that maybe, I can see maybe there is that one contradiction in the Quran, that little bit of doubt, I think, goes a long, long, long way to getting people to tolerate and to just live with one another. And I said this same thing before, and I'll say it again, but the difference between somebody who, let's say, I believe in an extremist, violent aspect of Islam, that's how I was raised, but the difference between me as someone who believes it and is willing to cut the throat of someone of a heathen, and me as someone who believes it who doesn't do that, is just a few degrees of doubt. That's all it is, right? If just you might be willing to kill somebody if you're like, this is the way it is, 100%. But if it's 99, if it's 98, you're not 100% sure, you won't take a life. You won't go at least to those extreme measures. So I think doubt is central to any progress that we're going to have in the Muslim world.
All right, boys, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Does that sound reasonable? Yes, you on the side there? Young man?
Okay, well, in the context of a classroom, if you're trying to teach a student the most scientifically accurate belief, I mean, wouldn't it be fair to denounce, if a student says their religious belief to the teacher, to tell them that's wrong? If you're treating, scientifically, if you're trying to have the most scientifically accurate belief, shouldn't you hold religion as the same standards as any other belief? You would think that's not scientifically accurate?
Well, I mean, I think if we're talking like sciences in particular, and the conversation comes up, I don't know about it being taught that that's the way that the world is or wasn't. But I know that there are teachers who bring up their personal faith here and there, or will dismiss or not neglect to mention aspects of religion. But the reason I'll go back to my feeling of mistrust of any kind of, governmental authority or any kind of authority that infringes too much on our right to believe. And so sometimes you get into a gray area there if you're, really in the classrooms, in curriculum, talking about how, look, there's no God, guys, or we don't have an evidence for this. But that's not something I've made up on my mind on. So that's an interesting question, but I'll be thinking about it.
And you, sir, in the lecture?
From an ex-Muslim to another, thank you for what you do. The last question would be, we know all the negative things that we can talk shit about Islam. Is there anything positive about cultural Islam or Islamic culture or Islamic religion, aside from the sense of community and family that you want, that you wish was greatly more widely adopted? My example would be the low-tub.
The what?
The low-tub.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think that's a practice that nobody gives up on, or very few ex-Muslims give up on. I'm not going to tell you guys what it is. It's toilet humor. But there are many. I mean, that's one of them. But there are many Muslim practices I think are not negative, and I think it would be inaccurate to say that the religion brings nothing but pain and suffering everywhere it goes. I mean, there's a reason it exists up until today. There's a reason that people are Muslims and feel so strongly, you know, that their religion is meaningful to them and that has brought them something good. I don't think they're crazy when they find that. As for specific practices, there's actually a lot that I think are maybe helpful or we should practice. But I like zakat and the idea that, which is the idea that you have to give a certain amount of your income to the poor every year. It's sort of mandated. I like the idea of it. I would never mandate it from a governmental level, but I like that there's an ethos of giving and providing for the poor and taking care of them and considering them as part of your community. And that ethos Islam carries on in a lot of different ways too, right? The no interest rule is banks and credit companies can't really exist in the same way in the Muslim world because interest is un-Islamic. To charge interest is un-Islamic. But that idea was, I think, put in place because of this desire to make sure people don't get, you know, screwed over by loans and by debt. And so there are absolutely good aspects of the faith, and that I miss. I enjoyed being a Muslim. I know it's hard to probably after all of this for people to believe, but I was a quite happy Muslim. It just stopped making sense, and when it did stop making sense, it was so painful for me to think that, okay, this is anything I can continue on any longer.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming. We're not in a rush to leave. We have room for another hour and a half or so feel free to have some more snacks and mingle, discuss amongst yourselves. And if you haven't been following Sarah's work yet, I would strongly encourage you to do so. She had a really great conversation recently on the Extremely Offline podcast with Shadi Hamid, who's the author of Islamic Exceptionalism book. And thanks for coming.